and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we are continuing our retrospective of the major news stories of 2025 from the Background Briefing archives, and we will go to an interview from November the 12th of 2025 on House Democrats releasing incriminating emails from Epstein expressing surprise that Trump had not been tied to his and Maxwell's sex trafficking victims. In one email, Epstein said that Trump spent hours with him and young girls at his house, going on to describe Trump in a 2018 email to Larry Summers as borderline insane. In response, Republicans on the House Oversight Committee just released 23,000 pages of documents from the Epstein estate. We discuss how the real smoking gun yet to be fired is Epstein's ties to Israeli intelligence. Joining us was Nina Burleigh, a senior editor at the New Republic, best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show. A professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute, she has written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible, and she's a producer of a documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow. Then we go to another interview from November the 30th of 2025 on the Trump administration's racist focus on the Afghan shooter of 2 National Guard soldiers in Washington, D.C., one of whom has died, prompting Trump's call to deport all immigrants from the Third World. We investigate the CIA-run Kill or Capture Zero units the shooter worked for in Afghanistan and speak with someone who has covered the U.S. war in Afghanistan from its outset after 9/11. Robert Young Pelton, an author, filmmaker, journalist, and explorer. He is the publisher of Dangerous Magazine and has had first-hand perspective on the war on terror from direct contact with the world's most infamous jihadi, rebel, and insurgent groups. His books include The World's Most Dangerous Places, Come Back Alive, 3 Worlds Gone Mad, License to Kill, Hired Guns in the War on Terror, and his autobiography, The Adventurist. He is working on a documentary about Jared Kushner's secret deals ahead of the Abraham Accords, which lined his pockets, and has a podcast at YouTube, Come Back Alive. Then finally we go to an interview from December the 7th of 2025 on emerging evidence of murder on the high seas following a closed-door intelligence briefing at which a select group of Republican and Democratic lawmakers saw the full video of the September 2nd strike on a small boat allegedly shipping drugs to the U.S. In spite of the alternative reality expressed by Senator Cotton, it appears that the second missile strike on Hegseth's orders to kill them all was murder on the high seas, and that if and when the public saw the video, the case against Hegseth would be devastating. Joining us was Rachel VanLandingham, a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, the Co-Associate Dean of Research and a Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School, as well as a former judge advocate in the U.S. Air Force. During her military career, she served as a senior legal advisor on the international law of armed conflict, military prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, appellate defense attorney, and nuclear security inspector stationed in the United States, South Korea, and Italy with deployments to the Middle East. She was the legal advisor for international law at Headquarters U.S. Central Command, where she advised on operational and international legal issues related to the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And before we begin, as this year ends and you can make tax-deductible donations for 2025, I'm hoping you consider backgroundbriefing.org/donate and publictruthmedia.org for your charitable giving, since we produce a daily news analysis program covering the major stories in the news 5 days a week on a very modest budget, and have recently expanded our production team from 2 people, that's me and Graham, to 5 employees as we expand our social media presence and have a new Gen Z reporter to engage the future generation in a coalition of boomers and zoomers out to make America decent and sane again, and the world a better place for all. So happy holidays to you, and the very best in the new year as we expand our fact-based community in post-truth America. And joining us now, Nina Burleigh, who's a senior editor of the New Republic, best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show. a professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute. She's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible, and she's the producer of a documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow. Welcome to Background Briefing, Nina Burleigh.
Thank you.
So, Nina, there's quite a bit of news breaking on the Epstein story, which you've been doggedly following for decades. And uh, it seems that the House Oversight Committee, the Democrats on the House Oversight Committee, have a pipeline into the Epstein estate, and they've managed to get some very incriminating emails that Epstein sent both to Ghislaine Maxwell and to the writer Wolf, who is apparently sitting on loads and loads, hundreds of hours of interviews with Epstein, which I don't understand why they can't be made public. So, what do you make of what's happening today? And of course, it's happening on a day that the House is finally opened after 7 weeks, where Mike Johnson shut down the House as a favor to Trump to avoid the Epstein files being released. But now they've had to seat the Democratic Congresswoman who will be the 218th vote on the discharge petition, which would break the logjam on releasing the Epstein files, even though that's not going to happen fast or even possibly. So let's start with today's breaking news. What do you make of it?
Well, it's the House Oversight Committee releasing a few of the, I don't know how many motherload of emails that they got and material they got from the Epstein estate. And they show Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell chit-chatting about Donald Trump in what Epstein says, that's the dog that doesn't bark, about Trump. And it's after he's gotten in trouble, and they're chit-chatting about how Trump, clearly knew what they were up to with the girls. And in fact, according to Ghislaine or Epstein, he was in the house for hours with redacted victim, which it turns out is, at least according to the Republican Oversight Committee members released, that it was Virginia Giuffre that they're referring to, that they've blacked out in that email. So what's happening now? As you said, the Arizona Democrat will be seated. The discharge petition is going to come fast and hard, and I think you're going to see, and you are seeing, an avalanche now. It's the gates are open now. You see, not just this, but this email. This is one. The ones today are just a bit of the Epstein estate material that the House Oversight has its hands on, and there's other material come out, and people putting together information, like Ryan Grimm and his associate there at Dropsite News, who've been doing incredible work taking these hacked emails of Ehud Barak, which have been out in the public domain for months, but basically ignored by the mainstream media. And we've been picking through them, as have a lot of people. But these guys over at Dropsite News have done incredible work taking those emails and putting between Epstein and Ehud Barak and putting them into a kind of a timeline with other things that were going on in American foreign policy and Israeli activity and things that were going on in the Middle East. And I think they're on their 4th installment of showing the relationship between Ehud Barak and Epstein, and how that relationship and how these emails between these two men, who clearly were not just buddies but in business together, were really engaged in a lot of influencing, at the very least, influence operation. And if this week's issue is to be believed, actual spy activity with drop sites in like an Apple store in New York City or something. So putting all of that together, what you're seeing, I think, is, and I don't know if the mainstream media is ever going to pick up on this, but I think, as most people have thought for a long time, but now I think it's undeniable that Epstein was engaged with Israeli intelligence and operating with at these high levels of American influence to, advance the interests of, Ehud Barak and the Mossad.
Well, the latest piece by Ryan Grimm and Murtaza Hussain at Dropsite News is Epstein in Israel. Israeli spy stayed for weeks at a time with Jeffrey Epstein in Manhattan. And as you pointed out, this has not been covered by the mainstream media. However, Trump's former lawyer from his first term, Ty Cobb, was on CNN the other day, and he was asked about the significance of the Arizona congresswoman being seated and therefore the discharge petition happening and what would the files reveal. And he didn't think there would be much coming from what the House endeavor is because it's going to take a while. The Senate's got to get involved, and God knows when it would be released. But he said, Ty Cobb, that the real action is at the CIA. That's where the real smoking gun is. And he went on to say that Robert Maxwell, who's clearly had ties to Mossad and who was buried in a place of honor in Israel, he essentially handed over his Mossad and KGB contacts via his daughter, Ghislaine, to Epstein. So Epstein inherited the Robert Maxwell portfolio, and that is unbelievably explosive.
I didn't know that Ty Cobb said that on television. When we worked on the Ghislaine Maxwell 3-part documentary, we had heard that and basically pretty much surmised that that was the case. But you can't, the people who are telling us these things are, they've been attacked and discredited, and now one of them's dead. So I don't know where Ty Cobb's getting that information, but we definitely had heard that the whole Epstein Ghislaine Maxwell thing begins in London with Robert Maxwell, kind of anointing him as his replacement.
Well, that would indicate that the CIA is at least what Ty Cobb's saying, that the CIA has the real stuff, the explosive stuff, but we don't know whether or not it still exists, right? We don't know.
Right. I mean, I don't know what is more explosive. I mean, these articles that have been put out by Ryan Grimm and Dropsite are, if they were on the front page of the Times, would be explosive, right? I mean, they're based in fact. So, and the emails, the amount of interaction between Ehud Barak and Epstein for years, their interactions. I mean, there's the interaction with Putin between the two of them. They are, messing about in, Syrian affairs, the whole gas, remember the nerve gas thing with the, the Syrian government supposedly nerve gassed. And then there was this like response, well, maybe it was a false flag to get the Americans because it was a crossing of the red line. You see Ehud Barak and Epstein back and forth over that. While Ehud Barak ought to write another op-ed, they were editing an op-ed for the New York Times that Ehud Barak was going to put his name on that would say, how much longer are we going to wait before we bomb Iran, before the U.S. bombs Iran? And, the just nonstop interaction between these guys. It's all in these emails that were hacked. And I guess, these big papers, the big companies are now, I don't know, they certainly didn't mind picking through the hacked emails of Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Podesta. But, maybe they have some kind of rule now that they don't look at those things. I don't know. I don't work there. But
Right.
It's incredible that the mainstream media is ignoring this because whether or not the CIA has material, there is a lot of material out there. And again, as I said, I think the avalanche is going to start coming out. I think just 2 days ago, there was there's the story that we have, that Ghislaine Maxwell took one of Epstein's trafficked girls, young women, who was a teen. She was a British model, teen, who had spent several years being raped and trafficked by Epstein, and who went on Dateline and said that she was like after Epstein died, she was among a bunch of girls who went on television and said, yeah, he was doing this to me. Well, we found documents in newspaper articles that talk about Ghislaine Maxwell took this young woman after she left Florida, after the period of 3 years of being groomed and raped by Epstein, introduces her to Trump in New York. And it's covered in like the British tabloids, like, oh, a hot new model that has caught the eye of a billionaire in New York City, and talks about how Trump moved her into his building, gave her an apartment. And we were always wondering, when is this girl going to talk about the Trump connection? And she just did. 2 days ago, she went on live TV and said, yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell, introduced me to him, and Ghislaine made it clear to him that I had been one of Epstein's pets, or, victims. So I think stuff like that is going to start coming out. I think also that, Jamie Raskin, congressman from Maryland, recently sent a letter to Pam Bondi asking her about reports from the SDNY, the district, the federal prosecutors in Manhattan, that they were actively still investigating Epstein in 2024, and in 2025, in January of 2025. So literally Trump gets inaugurated, and literally at that point, the Pam Bondi and the Justice Department tell the Manhattan feds, to turn over the material and shut it down. I think that is an incredible coincidence, and I think that more needs to be made of it. Raskin wrote the letter last week. Maybe it was buried in because of the shutdown. People didn't cover. But again, the fact that they shut the investigation down the minute they got in there, and then they took the material to Washington, and they've now flagged it we know that they put, these FBI agents on duty to flag Trump's name and put it in some kind of spreadsheet. And so I don't know that even if the House oversight, or the House itself, votes to get all that stuff out of the Justice Department, who knows whether they're actually going to see whatever it was. Right. So that the only hope is really to get it from like this Epstein estate, or maybe there's stuff down at the U.S. Virgin Islands case with JP Morgan. I don't know, but I don't know that they're going to, if they've put that many agents on it, but the fact that they would shut down the investigation at that point in time, per Jamie Raskin's letter, is mind-boggling.
But not surprising. And in fact, I talked to some intel people, ex-CIA, that said that they thought that the first thing that Trump did in January when he took over was to have all that evidence that the CIA had destroyed. But presumably, and so there's some suggestion that people inside the so-called deep state made copies. So something may surface there. But just to finish up on Epstein and the Israelis, the point is about inheriting the KGB and the Mossad file from Robert Maxwell. Epstein, his value to both the Russians and the Israelis was the compromat, right? The honey traps, the blackmail that he had on all of these powerful people.
Sure, absolutely. He was always, I mean, that's what he was. That's what he was doing. It was a blackmail factory.
Right.
It was a compromat factory. And that's why there was you can never be sure that he was just working for the one side, right? Because Maxwell, Robert Maxwell actually was like a triple spy. I mean, he was involved in the October surprise stuff with Iran, and getting promise into Russia, the surveillance material the surveillance program that the CIA wanted to get into Russia. So he worked for like different, he was helping get Soviet Jews into Israel. So he had to work with the KGB. And that's this kind of job that people like that have, where they're like one rung below. They're engaged in intelligence, but they're not like actually on the payroll. I don't know what you call them. I know
Right,
Greg Olear and those guys call them the Rocketeers. I don't know if you
right.
can say it on radio. Uh,
Well, the Ryan Grimm articles also indicate Ehud Barak working with Epstein, and the Israeli spy that Epstein had holed up at his apartment in Manhattan for a long time. They met with Larry Ellison,
yes.
and Larry Ellison had, when he got started, Oracle got started on a CIA contract with stolen Russian software. So there's
It
an
all
interesting
comes
story.
full circle, and now he runs one of the major networks. Well, his son owns the major network in the U.S. and puts Barry Weiss in charge of it.
Right.
Apologist for genocide.
Right. So just in the last minute, though, we need to go back to the revelations today of Epstein's emails to Ghislaine Maxwell and to the author Michael Wolff, who was sitting on a ton of material, which I don't understand why that can't be released. But in any case, in April of 2011, Epstein wrote to Maxwell saying that I want you to realize that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump. And then he went on to say that, and it turns out to be Gouffre, spent hours at my house with him. He has never once been mentioned. And then she writes back, Maxwell writes back, I have been thinking about that. Isn't that an interesting contrast to Maxwell's deposition with the Deputy Attorney General, former Trump defense lawyer, where she talked about Trump being a perfect gentleman? She knew all about it. They're
Oh,
basically saying,
oh, absolutely.
how come Trump's escaped scrutiny? That's what they're talking about.
Absolutely. She is a complete and utter liar. And that's the other piece of news that's come out that the way she's being treated down there, preparing herself to get a commutation. Basically, that prison is like, the Bureau of Prisons has set up the Hotel Creole for her down there. I mean, it's, the relatives get to come in, they bring snacks, they gave her Wi-Fi. It's unbelievable. And yeah, she's lying. And the emails, I'm sure Trump will just say those are fake emails or something, and they'll just keep bulldozing on. But we know.
But what's just in closing, though, what does it mean here when Epstein, in an email in 2019, where he claimed that Trump knew about the girls, and he asked Maxwell to stop? What does that
Yes.
mean?
What
What?
what we read that as meaning stop stealing my girls. Stop stealing girls from Mar-a-Lago. Stop poaching babes from Mar-a-Lago. That's what that means.
So he's telling Maxwell to tell Trump to stop stealing girls like he did
No,
with.
the other way around. No, that's what they're, she says, he says he told Ghislaine to stop. He means Trump told Ghislaine to stop. That's what that email is. And Trump told Ghislaine to stop taking girls from Mar-a-Lago. That's how I read it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, there's obviously a lot more to learn, and I appreciate you joining us here today, Nina Burleigh.
Anytime.
And again, I've been speaking with Nina Burleigh, who's a senior editor of the New Republic, best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show, a professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute. She's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible, and is the producer of a documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the fusion of techno-fascism and Christo-fascism with Elon Musk's Monaco capitalism embracing the Christian nationalism of Petro-Baptists. We're going to take a brief station break and back with an interview from November the 30th, 2025 with Robert Young Pelton. And joining us now is Robert Young Pelton, an author, filmmaker, journalist, and explorer. He's the publisher of Dangerous Magazine and has had first-hand perspective on the war on terror from direct contact with the world's most infamous jihadi, rebel, and insurgent groups. His books include The World's Most Dangerous Places, Come Back Alive, Three Worlds Gone Mad, License to Kill, Hired Guns in the War on Terror, and his autobiography, The Adventurist. And he's working on a documentary about Jared Kushner's secret deals ahead of the Abraham Accords, which lined his pockets. Welcome to Background Briefing, Robert Young Pelton.
Hi, Ian. Always a pleasure.
Well, thanks. And of course, later in the program, we'll be talking about what's going on now in Moscow, where Jared Kushner is with Steve Witkoff, and they're making secret deals with Putin. And of course, as far as Trump and Kushner and Witkoff are concerned, Ukraine costs them money. So, but Russia, you can make money if you give Putin what he wants. And that's what these creeps are up to, I'm afraid. But anyway, we'll.
No secret we live in a transactional government. So
No. But let's talk about the 29-year-old Afghan Ramanullah Lakanwal, who killed this Army specialist, Sarah Beckstrom, from West Virginia, and gravely wounded Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf. His whole story, we're sort of looking into it. And I know you went in to Afghanistan with the first group of CIA and special forces after 9/11, and you were there, for example, when the American Taliban Lind was captured, and in fact, he was in your custody for a while. So your time in Afghanistan goes right back to the beginning. But then later on, you're working for a 4-star on the drug problem, and that focus of that was, of course, in Kandahar, which is pretty much where Lakanwal was operating with these zero squads. So take us back to that period, because I take it that Lakanwal was recruited when he was 16 by a brother who was a deputy commander of one of these zero units, which are otherwise referred to as death squads.
yeah, well, remember in the very beginning, there were two operations. One was the military, which was special forces, and then there was also the CIA, and then they sort of split off. But they both hired local Afghans to bulk up their security and attacks. The CIA went down one road where they did, I guess they call them zero units, but they began sort of trusted people who came in. I write about this in my book, License to Kill. And do you remember Billy Waugh, the world's oldest CIA paramilitary? When they were chasing bin Laden, he had a very, very negative view of these people. He basically called them no good, lying shitheads, because they did it for the money. Later on, they cleaned up their act, and they used all kinds of ways to determine whether somebody was telling the truth or not. But the sad thing is that they were used as punishers, as death squads. They worked at night mostly. They went in, kicked in doors of compounds, dragged people out. There's lots of reporting on violent events that occurred, and they worked directly under the CIA, so the Special Activities Division. They were supposed to be an Afghan intelligence unit, but they were commanded by the CIA. And this was to provide deniability. So if somebody did get killed, they could say, well, I would talk to the Afghans, we don't know anything about it. But what they found out before Wally Karzai was assassinated was that they were also used as enforcers in the drug business. So when you gave people like Wally Karzai, who was Hamid Karzai's brother, and one could argue the tougher, meaner, smarter one of the two, they found out that he was involved in the drug trade, and he was using his CIA-trained units as his muscle. And when I was working for McKiernan, the 4-star at the time, he asked me, well, could you check into this? And I said, sure. So he came back with all kinds of eyewitness accounts of these guys being used as muscle, right? And he said, what should we do? And I said, well, he's the president's brother. So either you could expose it in the media, or you could take him out, which is the sort of the Afghan way. And he was taken out by one of his trusted bodyguards. So they had a colored past. And the saddest thing, and I have to say this because it's very important, the people that fought along the Americans, the Afghans, are some of the most trustworthy, reliable, and actually patriotic people now that they're here. And they all have very sad stories of night after night of violence against their own countrymen. And a lot of them did suffer from mental problems and from PTSD and survivor's guilt, things like that. There was no mechanism to deal with these people if they were traumatized by this incessant use of violence. So, this gentleman, I don't want to comment on his motivations because I don't know, but it would not be unusual that this man suffers from mental problems from years and years of incessant combat.
Well, if he started out at 16 in these zero units doing these kill or capture night raids, he must have seen an awful lot of violence.
Yeah, and remember, these are violence against families because Afghans typically live in family compounds. So I did a lot of time with special forces and raids and with Afghan commandos and with units that were trained to basically bear the brunt of the violence. So they would go in, they would kick in a door, they would drag people out, people get shot, people would run away, they get shot, people get interrogated, dragged away. It's an ugly business because it isn't black and white. When you go into a compound with like 60 to 200 Afghans, they're not all Taliban. There might be a Taliban commander there, or there might be a bomb maker there. But this war on them, and remember, we relied on these people to cover our back. After Trump and Pompeo surrendered to the Taliban, these were the teams that covered the retreat of the Americans in 2021. And people forget that. And they put as many as they could on planes, but some were left behind and some families were left behind. So there's a lot of pressure and tension with these groups.
So back in 2017 to mid 2019, Human Rights Watch reported and documented 14 cases in which the CIA-backed Afghan strike forces committed serious abuses. So it's not as if this is only being discovered now, right? It was uncovered back in real time, was it not?
Yeah, and remember, the goal all the time was to train up enough Afghans to provide security for their own country. So you had basically small groups of Americans training larger groups of Afghans, and these zero units would have sort of the higher quality, of these guys because they were more trusted. Because remember, we had problems with Afghans killing our people inside the camps. So these groups, and I don't want to defend the violence, but what I'm saying is there were thousands of raids in which violence occurred, and so the CIA insists that they were there, that they monitored these people, and the Afghans also say that they were told where to attack, when to attack, when to fire, all these type of things. So we see the tip of the iceberg. We don't see the whole story, and these Afghans can tell you stories. I mean, they go on forever.
Right, but it's pretty dysfunctional to be trying to sort of stabilize, save a country from itself when the president, his brother, is the biggest opium dealer in the world. I mean,
Well, this was the dilemma of Afghanistan. We went in to save it, but there wasn't a lot to save. These zero units, there were 10,000 Afghans in these zero units, and there was another 11,000 commandos that worked in the military under special forces. We were supposed to have 100,000, security individuals that were supposed to bring peace and order. But nobody really felt comfortable that the Americans were going to stay around and do things like airstrikes, medevacs, fun things. So people just started stealing things. And again, I'm not going to blame the zero units because they were closely monitored, but they're fighting in a war in which their own relatives are making money and working with the Taliban.
well, it's interesting now, of course, that the Taliban apparently have cut back on opium production, and it's moved into Balochistan, Pakistan, and into Iran.
Yeah,
And
remember the heroin business, the poppy business was never a Taliban thing. It was sort of in the gap. We started it when we went in the 50s and created all these irrigation areas that were supposed to be for wheat and cotton and other things. They ended up supporting vast poppy crops, and most of that poppy goes to Pakistan or Iran. the Taliban came in, in the mid-90s, and they said they shut it down, but they actually had a drought, which caused most of it to stop. But during the war, the actual members of the Afghan government under Karzai were running drugs. I mean, that was a big business for them, and they had the protection to do it with. I don't think there's any linkage between the zero units and the CIA in the drug business, but serious people were running opium that worked for the Afghan government. So it creates that same dilemma we had in other wars where there's the good and bad are sort of mixed up together.
Right, and we always pick the worst kind of leaders to support. I mean, isn't
The
there
ones we can pay.
right? Isn't there a parallel with Thieu leaving Vietnam with so much gold that the vehicles couldn't move?
Yeah,
And
Laos.
and the same thing with Karzai. He took a plane out full of cash and whatever else he could grab.
It's the same old story. And the thing is that we got in there. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan before 9/11, and I was there, during most of the events that happened. And what I saw was a constant attempt to do something that was physically impossible, but was mandated by this American sense of fixing Afghanistan so the Taliban wouldn't come back. And the Taliban never left. They were always there as sort of the other alternative. And it was extremely common for people to have joint allegiance, where if the Taliban pay me to do this, I'll do that. And if the Americans pay me to do that, I'll do that.
So, what do you think? Is there any way to figure out what went on with Ramanullah Lakanwal, who drove all the way across the country from Washington State to the capital and then ambushed and killed these two West Virginia National
Well,
Guards?
I'll tell you some sad stories, because Afghans are like Americans. They believe in personal freedoms, guns, pickup trucks, you name it. They would fit in Texas just fine. And when they worked with the Americans, they saw a way forward. Afghanistan was a very poor, backward country. So when you work with Americans, these people were promised visas. If they served for a year, they would get these special visas. So they became very Americanized. But when they came to America, they were shocked by the culture, in which people would say, "Oh, you must be a terrorist because you're a Muslim." It's like, no, I fought in more battles than most Americans have to defend Americans. And I personally know people that have lost their eyes and been wounded, that open up a bar or do something just to get, settled in, and they're hated on because they must be Talibs or terrorists. And, our president is not helping in this at all. So if this one guy chose to do whatever he did, it doesn't mean that every Afghan is going to jump up and start shooting people. And they went through so much for America, and they were so betrayed. So it's a very sad story, and it shouldn't be handled the way it is, by our government right now.
Well, Trump is closing the door on what he calls people from the third world. He's just so violently and openly racist about it. And the only people that Trump wants to let into the country are white South Africans. So he's just behaving in a despicable way, and it's absolutely shameful, his response. And of course, he's blaming it all on Biden when he was the guy that made the dirty deal with the Taliban along with Pompeo and Khalilzad, right?
Yeah, and remember, when Pompeo went to Qatar, he brought a letter that essentially surrendered the country to the Taliban, who were not even in power. And this is unthinkable. It's like Roosevelt surrendering to the Nazis or something in England, He handed them the country and freed a bunch of 5,000 prisoners. And there were only 2,500 troops in what used to have 100,000 troops. So all the facilities and all the investment was gone. It was just thrown away. And when Biden was handed this steaming bag of, whatever, he had to deal with only 2,500 troops inside the entire country, and moving out all the families, all the Afghans, all the translators, all the intelligence operatives. We sent in more troops to rescue those 2,500 troops that were on the ground. We sent in 3,000 American troops to pull them out, and it was a mess.
Right. And we were evacuating 76,000 Afghans, right?
Yeah. But this wasn't Biden's mess. This was handed to him as a predetermined conclusion, right? But when you basically wipe out all the troops in Afghanistan, there will be chaos, there will be violence. And these poor guys in the zero teams tried to defend the bases, but were overwhelmed. They didn't get ammunition, they didn't get air supply, they just fell apart.
Right. So what do you think then is going to happen in this country with a leader who is the worst reflection of the worst of America, and he's stirring the pot in an incredibly toxic, horrible way. And meanwhile, of course, he's trying to start a war with Venezuela by closing off the airspace. So, do you think that
Well, if you
life?
want my opinion, first of all, that poor girl should never have been there. There's absolutely no reason for uniformed military to be patrolling and picking up trash and weed whacking, and then get murdered. I mean, they're basically presenting a threat to people, right? And shouldn't be doing that. Secondly, we need to hold Trump accountable. It was an illegal act. Judge ruled that you shouldn't be here, and that poor woman died because of Trump. There's a direct connection between Trump trying to show off and this poor woman's death and the other man shooting. So there's that. And then finally, we need to understand that if the individual who does something does not necessarily bring the entire nation or religion or whatever into that same firestorm, right? This guy, I mean, I'm sure we'll hear his story backwards and forwards, but he fought for America in Afghanistan. He wasn't in Taliban. He wasn't a traitor. He wasn't a murderer. He was a guy that was vetted and trusted by many Americans. And we should at least give him that, even if he kind of lost it and went off and murdered somebody.
Well, just in closing, it's pretty clear that Trump, as you've pointed out, Robert, is responsible in a way for the death of Army Specialist Sarah Beckstrom. He's also behaved incredibly in a disgusting way when asked about whether he'd go to the funeral. He said, "Oh, I haven't really thought about it. But, I won West Virginia by the highest margin in the history of politics." And
Let's
of course,
be honest.
congratulating himself. But he is the commander in chief. And he
Yeah.
sent those troops into Washington, D.C., and he's now sent in an extra 200. And he's given them no direction, no mission, no clarity. So he's responsible.
Yes, and let's be clear about something else. Trump is in the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia, and it's clear in all the words he says, the action he takes, and he shouldn't be in charge of anything. And so this is what happens when you make dumb decisions, right? This is the exact consequences of using our military the wrong way, as we're seeing in Venezuela as well, where we're wiping out boats with most sophisticated SEAL Team 6, drones, all this kind of stuff. This is a man who's incompetent and making terrible, deadly decisions.
And there's no adults around to stop him. He got this ridiculous character running the Department of Defense, this complete embarrassing buffoon, and his partner running the FBI. You got Russia's girlfriend running our intelligence, along with a complete useless lackey at the CIA. I mean, this is our national security team. I mean, and by the way, there's a whole bunch of them. The reason why we're so screwed up over what to do about Ukraine is there's you got Rubio running one track, you've got Driscoll running another track, you got Jared and Witkoff running another track. It's ridiculous. No
Well,
wonder
okay, just imagine that Trump's goal at this point is to make as much money and to be the wealthiest man on earth, and everything tracks from that, right? And people say, well, Russia tells him to do this. I think money tells him what to do. If you write him a check, he'll pardon you. If you write him a check, he'll look the other way or flip his political opinions or back your cause. And this is a man who was teetering on bankruptcy when he came into office in 2016, 17, and now is coming out the other side with an offshore empire, and not an American empire, but an offshore empire created by foreign dictators. And that's it. That's his legacy.
right. And he just pardoned this crooked former president of Honduras who was in the drug trade.
Well, there's a
So,
lesson there. If you take a small boat with 11 people and a few pounds of kilo of cocaine, you get blown up. If you take 400 tons and put it on a ship, you have enough profit there to pay off Trump to pardon you. So there's the lesson to the drug smugglers of the world.
well, Robert Young Pelton, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Always a pleasure, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Robert Young Pelton, an author, filmmaker, journalist, and explorer. He's the publisher of Dangerous Magazine and has had a first-hand perspective on the war on terror from direct contact with the world's most infamous jihadi, rebel, and insurgent groups. His books include The World's Most Dangerous Places, Come Back Alive, Three Worlds Gone Mad, License to Kill, Hired Guns and the War on Terror, and his autobiography, The Adventurist. And he's working on a documentary about Jared Kushner's secret deals ahead of the Abraham Accords, which lined his pockets. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with an interview from December the 7th of 2025 with Lieutenant Colonel Rachel VanLandingham.
Christmas on the moon, Christmas on the moon. Hurry Santa, make that rockin' zoom. Christmas on the moon, Christmas on the moon. We'll be waiting Santa this Christmas on the moon.
And joining us now is Rachel VanLandingham, who's a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, the Co-Associate Dean of Research and a Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School, as well as a former judge advocate in the United States Air Force. During her military career, she served as a senior legal advisor on the international law of armed conflict, military prosecutor, criminal defense lawyer, appellate defense attorney, and nuclear security inspector stationed in the United States, South Korea, and Italy, with deployments to the Middle East. She was the legal advisor for international law at Headquarters United States Central Command, where she advised on operational and international legal issues related to the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Welcome to Background Briefing, Rachel VanLandingham.
Thank you, Ian, for having me back.
Well, thanks for joining us, Rachel. And I think the context that we need, though, about what's happening in and around Venezuela is that we are not at war. We just mentioned the wars that you were involved with, the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. No such situation exists today, yet we are apparently, it would seem, close to going to war against Venezuela, and that blowing up these drug boats have been, or the alleged drug boats have been justified as if we are at war. But the important thing to note is that we are not at war. So everything that's happening in the Caribbean now is essentially illegal, is it not?
Yes, it is. And this is, a theme and a point that I've been trying to emphasize in media engagements for months now, since the first strike in September became public, was that the Trump administration, even before they, seemingly, because I'm not sure when they put together their still classified Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel legal memorandum that supposedly tries to justify these strikes as lawful. I've been emphasizing that the Trump administration is trying to abuse the incredible, and very expanded authority to use lethal force during an actual armed conflict, during war, that exists, during the legal paradigm that replaces peacetime law enforcement legal authorities for when a government agent, such as a police officer down, here in downtown Los Angeles, or the Coast Guard on the high seas, when they can use force with the ability to use force based on status. So let me explain here. As you know, Ian, and as most Americans know, our police officers can only use deadly force when it's absolutely necessary. When they face an imminent threat of deadly force, they can proportionally use deadly force in response in order to protect themselves or others from that imminent deadly threat. In war, one of the biggest legal differences regarding the authority to use lethal force, the ability to kill people, is that in war, the United States and other warring parties can kill people based on status, based on who they are, and not just on what they're doing. In the rest of the world, and the rest of the time, police and government agents can kill people based on what they're doing. Just like you and I could. If someone pulled a gun on us, is about to kill us, we can use lethal force in response to, out of, pure self-defense. So that, that's why determining when we're actually in an armed conflict and when we're not is a life or death, literally, determination, because it triggers then this authority to use force to go after the opposing army. And so the law of war has made this trade-off, this ultimate trade-off, which is, look, individuals that belong to, and it's all predicated upon the analogy of that we're fighting an armed force, such as a military. When you're fighting a military, all those individuals are part of the military, and their job is to kill the enemy. And your job is to kill them. And so as long as they are not incapacitated, that is out of the fight because they're a prisoner of war, they're either on the battlefield and they're unable to fight because of wounds or sickness or surrender, you can kill them even when they're sleeping in their barracks, or even when they're on some Navy ship during time of war on the high seas. That's the best time to kill them, is when they're not expecting it. You can kill them because of who they are. That analogy does apply to folks that aren't in the military, but in what are called non-state armed groups. And this is where this becomes key. So, for example, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but let's go back to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a group that was organized to such a degree that it could carry out protracted, intense violence, that is, hostilities against the United States, like it was a military. And in fact, we saw that because it successfully, tragically attacked us on 9/11. Therefore, the United States was immediately in what the law calls a non-international armed conflict. And it calls it non-international because Al-Qaeda was not a state. It was not Russia versus Ukraine, which is an international armed conflict. But we were at war immediately against Al-Qaeda. And why? Because they are an organized armed group that had the capability and obviously the will to engage in, a protracted level of violence. And here they engaged in violence, and there was intelligence they were going to engage in further levels of violence against the United States. So we're immediately at war. So we can be at war against non-state armed groups. We could be at war against terrorist organizations such as ISIS. ISIS, of course, was born in United States military detention in Camp Bucca, Iraq, where the United States was improperly detaining thousands of military-age males and allowing them to all be indoctrinated in our own detention. So we helped contribute to that, unfortunately. But ISIS developed and became an organized armed group with such lethality and capability that they began killing American soldiers, taking over large swaths of Iraq and other areas there in the Middle East, and engage in actual hostilities. And so for us to be engaged in, as the Trump administration has claimed, to be in a non-international armed conflict against any armed group, and apparently they're claiming Tren Aragua and some other groups that they have not released yet, and some that they have released. These groups have to be, one, organized to a level of degree that they are capable of mounting, capable of mounting a high levels of violence, like they were a military. And number two, they're actually engaged in protracted violence against the United States, such that our regular law enforcement capabilities can't counter it. That the government has to make a decision. We've got to use the military here because we just can't handle these folks using regular law enforcement. Where is the threat? And this really just gives up the ghost. First of all, the level of organization isn't there. Number two, where's the protracted level of hostilities against the United States? These folks aren't trying to violently attack the United States. They're trying to sell the United States drugs. And so the Trump administration has said time and time again, look, these folks are carrying drugs. It's poison. That poison poses a threat to the United States, and therefore we're just going to blow them out of the water. That is not an armed conflict by the very facts that the government is saying. Even though the Trump administration throws on this, scary boogeyman label, narco-terrorists, these are terrorists. And they've declared some of these groups and put them on what's called the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And that's promulgated under federal law. It's a designation that federal law, Congress has allowed the State Department to make. And by putting an organization on this list, that does not mean we're allowed to kill them summarily. It allows the United States, by law, and we are a country that runs hopefully still by the rule of law, even though this is completely outside of that. The Foreign Terrorist Organization designation is one that allows the government to cut off funding for these groups, to provide for sanctions against these groups. It does not allow the United States to kill them summarily on the high seas. Boom, period, dot. I don't care how many times we jump up and down and call someone a terrorist. That does not mean there is legal authority to execute them. So, and second of all, it allows for criminal penalties for anyone that knowingly provides material support to one of these groups, primarily money, but also if someone tried to join one of these groups. It allows for the government not to kill them, but to arrest them and to prosecute them using our full panoply of criminal justice and the due process that's embedded within our criminal justice process. So this entire narrative, this military campaign of blowing boats out of the water is something that President Trump publicly said he wanted to do in 2023. There's interviews going back to President Trump in 2023, and then he was no longer the president. But he said, look, we just need to kill these guys. We're just going to kill them. Well, that's called murder. And the federal murder statute applies because it applies on the high seas and international waters due to our special U.S. federal law, special maritime jurisdiction. An intentional killing, unlawful killing, when someone is not posing an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death, is murder. When we're not in an armed conflict, if we were in an armed conflict, if individuals were determined to belong to a hostile group that was actually part of an armed conflict, as long as they're not out of the fight, they can be killed based on their status. But this is not a war. This has never been a war. An armed conflict is just the modern term for war. And therefore, this is just cold-blooded murder being perpetrated on behalf of the American people, complicit with the American people are being complicit if we're not demanding that our congressmen and women actually put a stop to this. And here, Ian, as you know, there has been a resolution that was put forward on a bipartisan front, but it failed on party lines. I think maybe there were two defectors that demanded an end to these targeted killings, to this campaign of murder, and it failed. And I'm hoping that the second incident that you can ask me about here in a moment, really started to bring in a stark relief that this entire operation is it's not pragmatically smart. How can you dismantle a drug running organization, drug smuggling organization, if you can't interview, that is, interrogate the individuals to be able to, because we're shooting fish in a barrel, taking out these small boats. Instead, the Coast Guard interdicted over 200 boats in the last year. They board them, they detain them, they ask questions, and when they find, and many of these developed into, okay, you arrest them, there's probable cause, you have evidence of drug smuggling, you interview them, then you start to build up the intelligence on the entire drug smuggling, organization, and that's how you can go after the higher level ones instead of just killing people and putting the evidence on the bottom of the ocean. So pragmatically, policy-wise, this is dumb. And it's ineffective, and it's already caused some of our allies to stop sharing intelligence with us on these drug operations. It's morally wrong, and it's unlawful. It's unlawful. It's murder, and it puts our military really in a dangerous predicament in which they're faced with unlawful orders that they would have to disobey at their peril. And unfortunately, we haven't seen enough disobedience.
Well, it does feel like we're being softened up for some kind of a war, and this 15% of the Navy's assets are there. And it reminds me of the WMD in Iraq, which was a kind of softening up process, that there's a real threat. In this case, they wanted to have the videos of these boats being blown up, but they won't let us see the second strike on the boat that was struck on September the 2nd. And there's emerging evidence of war crimes following these closed-door intelligence briefings at which a select group of Republican and Democratic lawmakers saw the full video of the September 2nd strike on the small boat allegedly shipping drugs to the United States. Now we're learning that they're actually shipping drugs to Suriname. But in spite of this, there was the alternative reality expressed by Senator Cotton. But it does seem that the second missile strike on Hegseth orders to kill them all was murder on the high seas. So when do you think the public will see this video? That would settle everything, wouldn't it? To see the 40-minute video resulting in the second strike on these two hapless guys on a piece of flotsam waving at the drone trying to surrender.
Well, I have several points to make in response to that. And first of all, I'm not sure it's going to settle everything because there seems to be a growing solidification along party lines here, making this a very partisan issue that folks are just going to fall in line and just follow Trump blindly, despite the path of illegality that he's bringing the United States on and putting our military directly in the middle of. Number two, let's talk about this. First of all, I'm not going to call this a war crime because you have to have a war for there to be a war crime. It's murder. And the second strike was doubly murder and even more cruel. And that's why that it hasn't been released to the American public yet. Because it's easy, just like you think of our executions and where the states that still have the death penalty. Very few folks see that, right? Because if most Americans had to look at someone that the government's putting to death on our behalf, they're very uncomfortable with that. If Americans can see helpless, shipwrecked individuals who had just survived attempted murder, desperately waving to the drones overhead to save them, and we wait 40 minutes and watching their desperation, waiting for the smoke to clear, debating back and forth, which required zero debate. I'm disgusted in the Navy and in Admiral Bradley that was even any kind of discussion on this. It should have been immediately been, where are the assets that we can send in to save these individuals? There was an utter failure of command leadership on this, period. But there's no war. That's not a war crime. It's murder. But I do believe the American public would react very viscerally to seeing our American military acting in such a cruel fashion, and they were put in that position but directly by Secretary Hegseth, who's happy to throw Admiral Bradley under the bus. Secretary Hegseth's also happy to come up with I mean, when is he lying, right? He's given several different inconsistent statements of what actually happened, right? And then posted sophomorically as a Ninja Turtle on Twitter, just acting like that taking people's lives is just a joke, that this is a video game. This isn't real war. This isn't a battlefield in which the United States service members are engaged with the enemy who's fighting them. There is no fight, unlike Senator Cotton said. These guys were trying to get back in the fight. The fight of what? There's cocaine on those boats. It's not a nuclear weapon.
Right.
There's no imminent threat, and this is plain old murder. And I've been so troubled by the fact of the lack of outrage of American people at this. There was a poll taken in the end of October, and it showed that a majority of, at least of those polled and extrapolated to America, they said a majority of Americans are uncomfortable with this. They didn't like it. But maybe there's outrage overload because we also have an outrageous immigration enforcement policy going on in which children are being ripped from their parents. We've got Black Hawk helicopters in Chicago where, these wannabe Navy SEALs are rappelling down into homes and ripping people out of showers. I mean, what kind of country are we allowing ourselves to be in right now? I want the American people to wake up and put a lot of pressure on Congress to actually put an end to this, because Congress ultimately has the power of the purse, and they have a National Defense Authorization Act that they pass every year, and they could be putting a kibosh on a lot of this. They could be passing some of these resolutions. They could be standing up and finding their intestinal fortitude to tell President Trump, yeah, this is enough. We're not going to do this in the American people's name.
So just in the last couple of minutes, Rachel, do you think, though, that the 800 flag officers, generals and admirals that were called to that ridiculous briefing in Quantico by Hegseth, where he strutted around in that Fox News style and talked about all of his ludicrous notions that somehow the United States military is no longer lethal and you have to forget about all the restraints and the wokeness and you just got to go out and kill people? They were clearly uncomfortable. Is there anything they can do to stop this guy who's got the power to fire them, and he's firing all of the talented people, all of the minorities, and all of the women and the highest ranks? But still, I wonder, just in closing here, Rachel, is there anything that the military can do? Because they clearly know that this is wrong.
Yes, they can follow Admiral Halsey's honorable stand and resign. Admiral Bradley, if he had honor, would be resigning right now. So if our senior leaders receive an unlawful order, such as to carry out these murders in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, they should refuse the orders and, if necessary, resign with honor, such as Admiral Halsey did. Admiral Bradley would say, I'm not going to do this anymore. He could try to compensate for his failure of leadership in passing on unlawful orders in this campaign of murder, and in particular that second strike. And he could be resigning. And that's what honorable men and women need to do, especially it's the top, right? And so I appreciated the public service announcement from the 6 congressmen and women led by the Honorable Senator Kelly and Senator Slotkin, reminding military members they have a duty to disobey unlawful orders. But it's really, really hard the lower you go down in ranks, because you disobey at your peril. And you've got the baloney Office of Legal Counsel memo trying to legally rationalize that all this is fine. Then you've got the top military lawyers and as you fired already, and then you already had other top leaders being summarily pushed out and fired. So it makes it really difficult to disobey an order at your peril. But that's what our 3 and 4 stars, like Admiral Bradley, that's what they're paid to do. They're paid to make these hard calls and to sacrifice their own career for the good of those underneath them and for the good of their oath to the Constitution. That's what I expect them to do. Do what Admiral Halsey did and resign.
Rachel VanLandingham, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
And refuse orders. Thank you so much. Refuse those unlawful orders. Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Rachel VanLandingham, who is a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the Co-Associate Dean of Research and a Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School, as well as a former Judge Advocate in the United States Air Force. During her military career, she served as a Senior Legal Advisor on the International Law of Armed Conflict, Military Prosecutor, Criminal Defense Attorney, Appellate Defense Attorney, and Nuclear Security Inspector, stationed in the United States, South Korea, and Italy, with deployments to the Middle East. She was the Legal Advisor for International Law at Headquarters United States Central Command, where she advised on operational and international legal issues related to the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.